The GTX 970 is a mid-range NVIDIA graphics card released nearly a decade ago. It was extremely successful, ranking at or near the top of the Steam hardware survey for a time. Today, I want to evaluate the usability of this legendary GPU and see if it's worth picking up on the used market in 2024. Released in September 2014 as part of the Maxwell 2.0 series, the GTX 970 features the GM204 core using a 28nm process, and it originally retailed for $329 US. The reference GTX 970 has a base clock of 1050 MHz, boosting up to 1178 MHz with a memory frequency of 1753 MHz. The card was infamous for its memory configuration, where only about 3.5 GB of the advertised 4 GB of GDDR5 memory was usable. The VRAM runs on a substantial 256-bit bus width. As for the 970's render configuration, the card includes 1664 shading units, 104 texture mapping units, and 56 render output units. The 970 is rated to be paired with a power supply of at least 300 watts or greater with a TDP of 148 watts. Today, the GTX 970 can easily be found on sites like eBay for around $40 to $50 in the US market. I recently bought a Gigabyte G1 gaming version for $42 on eBay. It has some solid factory overclocks and includes an extra DVI port along with the standard single HDMI instead of 3 display ports. I recently shared some in-game tests on the channel for the GTX 1060, which essentially succeeded the 970 as the most widely used video card in the years following its release. Based on theoretical performance, the two should perform very similarly in many cases, with the 1060 having the slight edge. In today's testing, I want to include some direct comparisons between the two graphics cards using the same in-game settings in a few titles. I will be using the GTX 970 in my GPU test bench, which includes a Ryzen 5 5600X, 32GB of DDR4 RAM, and a Gen 3 NVMe SSD running Windows 10. I'll use a capture card for in-game recording, and all games will be tested at 1080p resolution. To simplify things, I'll generally use presets that provide playable frame rates while considering graphical fidelity and overall stability. The GTX 970 still receives updated game-ready drivers, so I'll use the most recent driver 556.12 from June 27, 2024. To start, I ran CS2 at the high preset. In Dust 2, over the course of a few rounds of a bot match, the GTX 970 averaged 137 FPS. With the same settings, the GTX 1060 averaged 143 FPS after a similar elapsed time. Either card should be plenty for a high refresh rate experience in most esports titles like this one. Next, I ran Forza Horizon 5 at the medium preset. The GTX 970 fared fairly well, averaging 76 FPS during the built-in benchmark. As expected, the GTX 1070 showed a slight improvement with an average of 86 FPS. For the built-in Assassin's Creed Mirage benchmark at the low settings in native 1080p, the results were close, with the GTX 970 averaging 51 FPS and the GTX 1060 averaging 56 FPS. Notably, this title was the first one tested where the GTX 970 hit its VRAM limit of around 3700 MB, which will occur in more of these in-game tests going forward. In Cyberpunk 2077, using the medium preset, the GTX 970 delivered a solid and playable average of 43 FPS during about 10 minutes of driving around Night City. The GTX 1060, under the same conditions, averaged 50 FPS. This is a solid showing for the GTX 970, as around 45 FPS in a single-player game like Cyberpunk is fine considering the price of this card. In Hogwarts Legacy at native resolution with all settings on low, the GTX 970 averaged 51 FPS while traveling through various in-game environments. Under the same conditions, the GTX 1070 achieved a very slight edge with an average of 55 FPS. As for Starfield, the two cards performed very similarly. Both averaged about 38 FPS in the New Atlantis area at low settings with 66% render resolution, although the GTX 1060 had noticeably better percentile lows, indicating more stability, partly due to its extra onboard video memory. Starfield still is not a title that is forgiving on low-end hardware, but it's encouraging to see frame rates over 30 FPS despite the graphics being unimpressive at these settings. The last title I tested both GPUs with was Ghost of Tsushima, tested at medium preset with FSR set to quality. Over the course of the beginning parts of the game, both graphics cards averaged 40 FPS, which should be a trend that carries through the majority of the in-game environments. Red Dead Redemption 2 was a game I didn't test with the GTX 1060 but decided to play with the GTX 970. I used a custom preset with mostly high and medium settings, including high texture quality. The GTX 970 averaged about 51 FPS, which is certainly a playable output in this game. Lastly, I ran the classic GTA 5 expecting solid performance. This graphics card would have likely been one of the most popular new cards around the time of the GTA 5 PC release. With all settings on very high and all advanced graphics off, the GTX 970 averaged 110 to 120 FPS, only dropping in the more intensive areas like grassy and rocky terrains. Overall, when comparing the GTX 970 and the GTX 1060, the 1060 has the slight edge and will perform better in most situations, largely due to the extra 2GB of VRAM. Still, the GTX 970 performs impressively well despite being based on an older architecture from 2 years before the 1060. If you're considering either of these GPUs for a budget build, the main advantage of the GTX 970 is its lower price, coming in around $20 to $25 cheaper than the 1060 on the used market. Otherwise, in many cases, I would recommend the 6GB GTX 1060 as it will likely hold up better in the coming years. Anyways, I plan to release the next episode of the $100 flip-up challenge very soon, after I finish getting a few more components. If you would like to stay tuned for that, or you enjoy older PC component reviews like this one, consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. If you have a personal experience with the GTX 970 or any questions or suggestions, please don't hesitate to leave a comment. Thank you.